Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst mountaineering tragedies we have covered on this channel, from K2's most dangerous route to 2023 accidents to being abandoned in the death zone. We cover it all. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. On October 14th, Nadezhda Oleneva found herself alone above 6,500 meters with no oxygen, no Sherpa, and over 300 meters to her next resting area. Nadia was trying to summit 8,167 meter Dhaulagiri with no supplemental oxygen. She came to the peak with two fellow Russian climbers, but today they were all climbing alone at their own pace. They planned to regroup at 6,880 meters in Camp 2, but this was over 300 meters from Nadia's current location, and the most difficult part of her climb was right in front of her, a completely exposed, steep slope. This is where the final moments of her life would be spent. This is her story. Dhaulagiri, located in Nepal, is the 7th tallest peak in the world, standing at 8,167 meters or 26,795 feet. While the mountain is not extremely technical, it is still considered to be one of the more difficult 8,000ers to climb, due to how exposed climbers are on the steep slopes. The incline from Camp 1 to the summit is intense, and this is where most people lose their lives. But 38-year-old Russian climber Nadia Oleneva was certainly up for the challenge. She had been climbing her entire life, and to say she was experienced would be an understatement. Nadia was a big wall climber who had established difficult routes on remote peaks and had been recognized for her accomplishments several times, along with being considered one of the best Russian climbers of her generation. In 2019, Nadia and two fellow climbers traveled to the Bontovsky region in Russia. They were going to attempt several big walls in honor of one of the climbers' younger brothers, who had died on a nearby mountain. To get to their location, they had to trek through rocky, uninhabited terrain, and after reaching their target, they scaled 3 walls, with over 95% of the climbing being free, meaning they were only using gear for safety and not to progress up the face. What made this more impressive was that this was the first time anyone had scaled these peaks. In 2021, Nadia, along with 2 other climbers, would target an unclimbed mountain named Sharp Peak in Kyrgyzstan. The 4,818 meter granite needle had caught her eye in a photo, and after 2 days of difficult climbing, they would reach the top, becoming the first group to climb the peak, and thus give its name, Sharp Peak. But in 2022, Nadia accomplished her most impressive feat. In July, she and 2 other climbers would complete a first ascent of the main north face of 5,816 meter Pic Koraluva. On the first day, the trio climbed 700 meters vertically and another 450 meters of steep, sometimes vertical ice. The second day, they climbed 380 meters before setting up camp on a steep slope. Nadia would write, "Stomping down the snow so we could put up our tent took about 2 hours, and even after all this effort, 1/3 of the tent still hung over the void." On the third and final day, they climbed another 450 meters before reaching the summit. Many claimed this expedition was a masterpiece. All of these achievements led to Nadia being nominated for 2 Pile d'Or, one of climbing's biggest honors. But while Nadia was an experienced climber, there is just a key difference between a peak that is over 8,000 meters tall. While you can practice the technique, route, and prepare for years, these mountains are in a class of their own. Leading up to her expedition of Dhaulagiri, Nadia would express her excitement on Facebook, posting, "Our expedition to Nepal starts today. Team gathering at Kathmandu. Today we are leaving for Pokhara, and tomorrow we are flying a helicopter to the base camp. So I want to say, pinch me. I'm climbing the octopus. Look forward to new heights." Nadia would eventually team up with 2 other Russian climbers, Roman Abuldov and Rashim Kashapov, before making their way to base camp. They would be attempting to climb the peak with no Sherpa or supplementary oxygen. The main reason for this was that another Russian expedition was taking place on Cho Oyu at the same time, and they were all climbing in exclusively Russian expeditions to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Russian mountaineering and the Russian Ministry of Sports. After weeks of acclimatization, the group was finally ready for the climb, and on Friday, October 13th, they would set out from base camp. Base camp is considered to be rather low, but traversing above the camp is really the first test of the mountain. Similar to Everest, there is a giant glacier that must be traversed under the north face of the peak. This icefall is one of the most dangerous and tedious areas of the entire climb, but the trio would pass through the crevasses and seracs with no issues, reaching Camp 1 by nightfall. The following day, Saturday, October 14th, the trio would set out from Camp 1. This is when climbing on the steep slopes really began. The first part of the climb is a rather wide open ridge, but this leaves climbers susceptible to avalanches and brutal winds. As they progress up the slope, the ridge consistently steepens and narrows, with many hidden crevasses throughout the peak, until you finally reach Camp 2 at 6,880 meters. The plan was for the trio to climb this section of the peak at their own pace, and while Nadia was by all means a fast climber compared to the rest of us, she still lagged behind her two partners, meaning after a few hours, she was climbing alone with no oxygen or Sherpa to help guide her. Nobody knows what happened next. 4 hours after the trio left Camp 1, Alboldav would arrive at Camp 2, and Kashapov was only minutes behind him, but there was no sign of Nadia. They waited for a few minutes, simply catching their breath, but soon the duo started to question where she was. They were tired, as they had just spent 4 hours climbing the steep ridge, but the adrenaline was still pumping through them, and they could only think about their missing partner. The two men would make the decision to begin descending the peak to look for any trace of their partner, and after several minutes of climbing, they saw something in the distance. It was a colorful pole sticking out of the white snow, and as they approached the object, they began to realize exactly what they were looking at. It was Nadia's hiking pole, and this could really only mean one thing: something bad had happened. It still took them some time to make their way over to the hiking pole because remember, they were descending an incredibly steep ridge, but when they did reach the pole, their hearts would sink. The snow below the object had an obvious trail, as if someone had slid down the peak, and this trail would extend for as long as the duo could see. Eventually, they would follow it for over 200 meters before the trail would suddenly flow into a group of seracs and crevasses, disappearing. At this point, clouds were moving in, and the duo had to make a decision. They would call off the expedition and make their way back to base camp, barely making it before nightfall. They would hold out hope that Nadia had somehow slowed down, and with her sleeping bag and first aid kit, found a way to survive. But this just wasn't the case. The following day, the weather would clear and a rescue helicopter would begin flying over the common fall zones and avalanche chutes, but they would find nothing. Eventually, they would make their way over to the area Nadia's fall was expected to have ended, and within a large crevasse, they spotted something that looked strange. It didn't take long before they recognized what it was. They had found her. Nadia's death in 2023 would follow a series of controversial accidents in October, an accident that has its own video on my channel. While being a shock to the mountaineering community, those hurt the most would be her fellow Russian climbers. She was more than a partner. Her legacy and accomplishments lifted her higher than any mountain, but above all else, she was a climber. Someone who loved to spend hours finding a new peak that nobody had heard of, then spend days struggling to hopefully step foot somewhere that nobody ever had before. The definition of true greatness. What obligation does a climber have when he or she comes upon a fellow climber in extremis? On May 15, 2006, 34-year-old Englishman David Sharp froze to death in Green Boots Cave on the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. Although he was climbing alone, before he left for the peak, he would reassure his mother, stating, "You are never on your own. There are climbers everywhere." But at his lowest moment, over 40 climbers would walk past him, and nobody would stop to help. His death ignited a controversy that continues to this day and became one of the most notorious mountaineering stories ever covered. The lessons that were learned that day will be told for generations. This is his story. Born in Harpenden, England near London, Sharp developed a passion for climbing at a young age. By conquering nearby hills, he enjoyed reading about mountains that lay beyond his hometown and dreamed that one day he would have the opportunity to stand on the tallest peaks in the world. He attended Prior Pursglove College and would later move on to the University of Nottingham, where he pursued a degree in mechanical engineering. While at university, Sharp joined the prestigious Mountaineering Club with the desire for adventure. He would take a break from his personal life and embark on a 6-month backpacking journey through South America and Asia. This immersive experience deepened his love for outdoor adventure and would be the catalyst for his future climbs. In 2001, David took on his first major adventure and traveled to the 13th highest peak, Gasherbrum 2. The mountain is located in the desolate regions of the Karakoram, and simply getting to base camp was a struggle for Sharp. The team was led by experienced mountaineer Henry Todd, and most of the expedition was spent trying to climb the mountain, battling harsh storms and snowfall conditions. Unfortunately, the weather prevented them from making much progress, but this seemed to only fuel David's desire to climb. In 2002, David embarked on a grueling expedition to Cho Oyu, a towering 8,188-meter tall Himalayan peak. Led by Richard Dugan and Jamie McGinnis of the Himalayan Project, the team showed great resilience and determination as they faced bad weather conditions and tough terrain. The group managed to conquer the peak, but this would be bittersweet and the first reality check for David. During their expedition, a fellow team member fell into a crevasse and lost his life, an accident that would have an impact on David for the rest of his life. Because of this death, an opportunity arose for David as Richard Dugan needed another climber for an Everest expedition in 2003. David had impressed Dugan despite his small frame and skinny build. The team, led by Dugan, compromised 5 other climbers, including David. Everest stands as the tallest mountain in the world at 8,848 meters and serves as one of the hardest challenges a mountaineer can ever face. The expedition was doomed from the start. Harsh conditions would begin the first day in the Khumbu Icefall, but throughout their time on the mountain that year, David would excel and prove that he was an exceptional climber. Eventually, 2 members of the expedition would reach the summit, Terrence Bannon and Jamie McGinnis. David, unfortunately, was stopped early by frostbite, eventually leading him to lose several of his toes. But during their descent, David and Dugan would encounter a Spanish climber who was clearly struggling on the steep slope. They would provide him an extra bottle of oxygen and help the man down the peak. The pride and recognition David received that year was almost as important to him as reaching the summit. I did say almost. He appeared to be one of the strongest climbers from the 2003 expedition, and this would begin to inflate his confidence. Don't get me wrong, the dangers of Everest definitely still scared him, but he desperately wanted to conquer that peak. In 2004, David would join a France-Austrian mountaineering expedition to the northern flanks of Mount Everest, led by renowned French climber Hugh Dubrade. It was on this trip that David would develop a commitment to solo climbing, as well as show skepticism towards using supplemental oxygen. This decision mainly came off the back of his success simply a year prior. This expedition would play a pivotal role in David's life, as he was not able to keep up with the other climbers and had to stop at 8,500 meters, while all other members reached the summit. Despite his valiant efforts, he would once again be reminded of the risk and harsh conditions, as this time the frostbite would affect his hands, serving as a painful reminder of his failure. In 2005, David would pivot his career and quit his job to become a teacher. He enrolled in training and planned to start teaching in 2006. Because of this, David was unable to embark on any major expeditions that year. With his desire for adventure building, he desperately wanted to feel the success of an Everest summit. Because of his disagreements with Hugh during his last expedition and a strong belief in solo climbing, David decided that for his 3rd attempt at the tallest mountain in the world, he would be alone. He also decided that once again, he would be climbing without the use of supplemental oxygen. If you have watched any of my previous mountaineering videos, you would know that only the most elite climbers attempt 8,000ers without oxygen support. The risk significantly increases no matter your skills, but David was determined to climb his way. He would join Asian Trekking due to their basic service package that offered limited supplies and be a part of the International Everest Expedition, which comprised of 13 other independent climbers. Due to the basic services, David was given food and supplies up to advanced base camp at 6,340 meters. Beyond that lay hundreds of feet of icy crevasses, steep drops, and towering slopes surrounding him. Near the beginning of May, David would spend 5 days completing acclimatization trips, traveling up and down the snowy terrain, preparing upper camps. He was also preparing his body for the cold weather and high altitude conditions. David refused to climb with a Sherpa, even turning down a friend's offer for a coordinated expedition, and on top of not using oxygen, he also refrained from carrying a radio for emergencies. Before the day of his climb, David's excitement was building as he tossed and turned in his tent, replaying every step from his previous expeditions. His focus was unbreakable. The mesmerizing mountains stood between him and his dream, and when the sun broke the horizon, David set off. The sky was clear and perfect for climbing, although the temperature was much colder than average. Despite not wanting to use supplemental oxygen, David brought along 2 small bottles for emergencies, although this would only last for about 8 to 10 hours of high altitude climbing, which would not nearly be enough if something went wrong in the rough terrain. It was not until the late evening of May 13th that David initiated his summit attempt from one of the upper camps. His plan involved traversing the notorious exit cracks in the northeast ridge's 3 steps, then making his way to the summit and returning to high camp. It was a daunting task, even for the most experienced climbers, and he had no intention of using his 2 bottles of oxygen along the way. The early stages of the climb did not prove to be too difficult, as David's skills allowed him to scale the mountain with relative ease. But as he got higher, the air became thinner and the challenge got harder. The dangers of climbing a high-altitude peak with little to no oxygen can range from headaches to confusion and even hallucinations. Luckily, the weather held, and there were no major storms, but slight snowfall was a common battle on the mountain. As he neared the summit, his progress slowed, but he began to encounter more and more climbers. He had to wait his turn to traverse small sections in some places, and a line began to form. Although David was climbing alone, many other mountaineers were chasing after the same goal. The smallest mistake can have deadly consequences. One boot slip on a ledge, you are plummeting down the peak. David was becoming more and more fatigued as the harsh conditions were taking a toll on his energy levels and overall health. He became dehydrated, and with the dwindling air, he began to feel disoriented. It was hard to keep focus, but David tried to move his feet one at a time, one after the other. Desperately needing to rest, David stumbled around looking for an area to bivouac. It was in the dead of the night on May 14th when David was ultimately forced to bunk for the night under a rocky outcrop known as the Green Boots Cave. The cave lies near the first step at an altitude of 8,500 meters or 28,000 feet. David, no longer caring about not using his oxygen, had depleted his supply quickly. It was experiencing problems with his equipment. The early stages of frostbite were already developing on his hands and toes. And to make matters worse, it was one of the coldest nights of the season. Up until this point, his predicament was unknown for various reasons. He hadn't informed anyone about his summit attempt, and he lacked the means to communicate his location or condition. To make matters worse, 2 other climbers from his group went missing around the same time, so their attention had been elsewhere. Initially, members from his group just assumed he had taken refuge in a high-altitude camp and was resting. Since David was a seasoned climber, they thought that if he was in real danger, he would have turned around before things got too dangerous. But as the hours ticked by, it was clear something had gone seriously wrong. Alarm bells did not start ringing until the evening of May 15th, when he had yet to return to camp. That same night, a group of climbers would reach the limestone cave where Green Boots marked the way, and they would get a nasty shock. When they glanced inside, they realized the long-dead climber had company. It was David Sharp. Sharp sat with his arms wrapped around his knees. Icicles hung from his eyelashes, and he did not respond to their shouts. The climbers thought he was already in a coma, but did not radio down to base camp for help. Instead, they left him behind. A mere 20 minutes later, another group came upon Sharp in the cave. Again, they shouted at him to get up and move, but this time, Sharp waved them off, not saying a word. A further 36 climbers were traveling towards the peak that day, some of whom attempted to speak to Sharp, and whose varying accounts of his condition would generate some of the controversies after his death. The bodies that lay frozen on the mountain's peak show how hard rescue can be. They often lay where they fell, since those above certain altitudes are simply too difficult to remove. The same holds true for struggling climbers who reach the mountain's death zone. Eventually, another climber and his team would stop in the cave on their descent from the summit, and after seeing Sharp, they quickly realized that there was nothing they could do. The climbers sat with him and prayed until they were forced to leave or risk their own life. As he left the cave, he radioed down to base camp, and the only thing those listening could do was weep. The main controversy regarding David's death was the sheer number of climbers who saw him while still alive. At least 40 others passed by him in the cave and did little to help him. Unfortunately, we will never know if he could have potentially been saved, but we do know he was never given the chance. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first climber to reach Everest's summit, was particularly disgusted by the attitudes of the climbers who passed by Sharp. He would state, "People just want to get to the top. On my expedition, there was no way that you could have left a man under a rock to die." The other side of the argument is that David put himself in that position and failed to prepare for a worst-case scenario by refusing to correctly inform others of his climbing schedule or simply bring a radio with him. But even if a rescue attempt might have been launched, it would have had to wait until sunrise, many hours after David climbed into the cave. By that time, his condition would have even been more hopeless. Whichever side you fall on, there is no doubt that there are lessons to be learned from David's climb and story. For many of us, this is just another reason not to climb mountains, but for those that do, it is important to prepare properly. Now, even with proper preparation, a mountain can simply disrupt all your plans, but at least you're putting yourself in the best possible position to be successful. David's life may have come to an end, but his story will be told in the mountaineering community forever. There is a route on K2 that was considered to be the most difficult climb on the Savage Mountain for over 25 years, and some of the most accomplished climbers from the 1980s and 90s referred to it as the most difficult route in all the Himalaya and Karakoram. The path pops up constantly throughout the history of K2 in some of the deadliest years of the mountain. In 2004, one man was successful in completing the climb, becoming only the second expedition to accomplish the feat. But it came at a steep price and ends in tragedy. This is K2's Magic Line. This is the story of Jordi Coromines. Although K2 is 781 feet shorter than the world's tallest peak, Everest, the 28,251-foot mountain is considered one of the most dangerous peaks in the world. Unlike Everest, almost every route on K2 averages 45 degrees from base to summit, meaning one slip, one rock fall, or even just some heavy snow, and climbers can tumble hundreds, if not thousands of feet down the slope with no ability to stop their fall. Additionally, the location of the mountain makes it particularly difficult to reach. There are no fancy tents or luxuries on the Savage Mountain, and the most difficult path to climb, one of the most difficult mountains in the world, is called the Magic Line. The first attempt of the Magic Line began in the summer of 1979. An Italian, German, Austrian team attempted to climb the route, but within weeks they realized it just was too difficult. They would eventually climb K2 the traditional route, becoming the fourth expedition to ever summit the peak. Later that summer, a French expedition made up of 15 climbers would attempt to climb the same path. It would take them over 21 days to establish a camp at 7,500 meters, and then an entire month to reach 8,000 meters before the expedition was called off. In 1986, 2 Americans would die on the Magic Line after a boulder would become loose and sweep them off the slope. A solo expedition led by Renato Casarato would also take place on the route that year. I have an entire video detailing his expedition, so feel free to check that out after this one. Spoiler alert, it did not end well for Casarato. 1986 would also be one of the deadliest years in the mountain's history. The first successful ascent would take place that same summer in 1986, when a 3-man Polish-Slovakian team would finally complete the magic line, but during their descent, one of their team members would fall to his death in the dark. In 2004, Jordi Coromines, Manel de la Mata, Oscar Cadillac, Jordi Tosas, and Dhaulagiri attempted to climb the magic line for the first time since 1986. Their attempt would be nicknamed the Tarragona Magic Line Expedition 2004. Like most expeditions, the climbers would fly into a nearby town called Skardu, then trek their way through the Karakoram over 10 days with the help of nearly 50 porters, carrying over 1,500 kilograms of supplies needed for the climb. After reaching the base of K2, they would establish base camp at 5,000 meters. This would be their home for the foreseeable future. The expedition was expected to last 2 months, consisting of climbing the magic line, establishing camps further up on the mountain, and leaving supplies along the route, then eventually descending back to base camp to rest before repeating the process, each time reaching a higher point. The first obstacle on the magic line is the Filippo ice field. Think of it as a smaller version of the Khumbu icefall on Everest. There are hundreds of crevasses and seracs surrounding the climbers, and of course, there is always a risk of avalanches. After reaching Pico Negrado at the top of the ice field, they would then climb a steep slope and establish Camp 1 at 6,400 meters. It took the original expedition over a month to reach this point, and after 5 attempts, the 2004 expedition would reach that same camp. This is when the expedition really began. From this point on, Jordi, Manel, and Oscar would be trailblazing. This means they would be on the mountain, establishing the route, while other members of the expedition would be at base camp, ensuring there were enough supplies and taking care of the daily chores. So after reaching Camp 1, Manel would be climbing above the other 2 men. It was a perfect day. The sky was clear, and the weather was on the warmer side, at least for K2. And they would need to take advantage of it because the climb from Camp 1 to Camp 2 is one of the most difficult areas, as it is nearly vertical rock scaling for most of the 500 meters that separate them. It was during this climb that while Manel was hanging on a steep pitch covered with rock and ice, he began to feel the dreaded mountain shake. It was an avalanche. He would quickly secure himself, grip onto his harness as tight as he could, and hugged the wall as large chunks of snow rained down on him. It felt like an eternity, but eventually the snow would stop, and Manel was still hanging onto the wall. He would radio down to Jordi and Oscar. Both had survived the avalanche, but it would frighten the trio and serve as a reminder of what the peak can do. At the end of July, there would be 2 days of clear weather, and the trio would make it all the way to Camp 3 at 7,500 meters. From Camp 3 to the summit, there is 1,100 meters of vertical climbing, but the real challenge is the altitude. While above 8,000 meters, the oxygen is a fourth of what it is at sea level, which makes the technical climbing 8 times harder than at lower levels on the mountain. There is no easy section of the climb, and that is what makes the magic line so difficult. On August 16th, Oscar, Manel, and Jordi would reach their last camp at 8,100 meters, where they would rest for a few hours before beginning the final summit bid at 4 a.m. For 6 hours, they would climb the vertical wall in the death zone. But at 10 a.m. at 8,300 meters, Oscar would decide to turn around, and minutes later, Manel would join him. After a short rest in the tent at 8,100 meters, they would both descend back to Camp 3, where they would spend the night. Meanwhile, Jordi would continue to climb the magic line. I cannot express the challenges and difficulty of the final 500 meters. Jordi was climbing a vertical rock wall covered in ice and snow above 8,000 meters alone. He was never truly sure if he was climbing the correct route because they had never made it this far, but he had no choice but to continue. After 24 hours of climbing, Jordi would reach the summit of K2 in the dark, becoming only the second expedition to accomplish the feat. After reaching the summit, Jordi would begin the descent almost immediately, but this time he would be climbing down the Abruzzi Spur. The only issue was he was descending in the dark on a route that he had not climbed. And for those of you familiar with the Abruzzi Spur, the biggest danger is the bottleneck, a tight couloir that has a giant serac constantly hovering over climbers. Jordy would eventually make it through the bottleneck and come across a Japanese expedition that would guide him down to Camp 3, where after 30 hours of continuous effort, he would finally get to rest. The next morning, Manel and Oscar kept descending. Despite the increasing bad weather and their exhaustion, they were both happy and content. On their way down, they talked about future projects and new climbs to attempt in the next months. They slept in Camp 2 at 6,900 meters, and the next morning, on Wednesday, they climbed back to Camp 1. It was then when Manel, for the first time, began to complain of acute abdominal pain that was preventing him from breathing normally. His health would quickly decline over the next few hours, but Oscar would stay by his side, helping him eat, hydrate, and stay warm. Communication with base camp would eventually break, as the severe cold had exhausted the batteries in the climber's radio. But Wednesday evening at 8 p.m., Oscar was able to send a short message that said "Help Negrado," referring to their current location. While rescue efforts would begin immediately, there was a severe snowstorm taking place, so nobody would be able to reach Camp 1 until the following day on August 19th. But it was too late. That morning at 4:30 a.m., Manel had passed away in Oscar's arms, concluding the 2004 expedition with success and tragedy. Manel would be buried at the memorial grave on K2, 500 meters from base camp. This is where the remains of many who have fallen on the mountain lay. After the expedition, Jordi Coraminas would state, "Had the summit been our main objective, we would have climbed the Abruzzi Spur, but we were interested in the process, the method, and the style of ascent. While the expedition would end in tragedy, the accomplishment cannot be understated. The most difficult route on the most difficult mountain in the world has never been repeated since 2004, and it is unlikely that anyone will attempt the climb anytime soon."